Yes, that goes to the question of what is it about living in families that inclines people toward religiosity. And I think there's not one mechanism, but several. And we'll start with a very basic one, having a baby. Now, this is a very ordinary experience in the sense that many of us are fortunate enough to have it. But if you were to ask most people what was the most important thing that ever happened to them, most people who have had children would say it was having a baby. And this translates for many people into the idea that there's a whole realm out there that I'm suddenly connected to, whether you want to call it a cosmic realm, a religious realm. Many people experience birth as a religious event. And we see this ratified again in the social science statistics, which I cite in the book and which I like very much because they bear this point out in spades. We know from sociology that people who are married are more likely to go to church than people who aren't. And we know that people who are married with children are way more likely to go to church than people who are not. And this effect is especially pronounced for men, interestingly enough. Someone who's a married dad is far more likely to be found in the pews on Sunday than somebody who isn't. So thus far, sociology has looked at that relationship and pretty much said, well, that's just what happens. People who go to church are more likely to have families. What I'm saying is no, turn that relationship around, because it looks like what's happening is that people who have families are more likely to go to church, and the transcendental experience of childbirth, I think, is one of the things that does this. And I'll give a quick anecdote about this because I think it's a powerful one. There's a great book called Witness, written by Whittaker Chambers, the great Cold War figure, who started off as a communist atheist and eventually made the trek back toward Christianity, and in his case, Quakerism. And in his memoir, Witness, he writes about what did that for him. And the pivotal moment was when he was sitting in the kitchen looking at his infant daughter in her high chair. And he describes being taken over by this feeling as he's studying her ear. It's such a mundane thing. But he realizes he could never have created this thing. He realizes he is a witness to something much bigger than he is. And he says, at that moment, the hand of God was laid on my head, and I began my trek back toward Christianity. Actually, he says the finger of God. I don't think you have to be an atheist or a communist to have that story resonate. I think a lot of people experience childbirth and having children in the same way, and that's one powerful thing that drives them to church. Or as a Baptist minister said to me on the radio recently, I know that every new parishioner I get is a young man or woman who shows up with an infant in arms. So what I'm trying to do is explain how that works, but that's just one of the things that drives people to church once they have families. There are other things, again, perfectly pedestrian things, but it all adds up to a bigger whole. So, for example, you know, if you've had children, that it's an awesome responsibility. It's a staggering responsibility. This, again, is an ordinary experience to look at a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old and think, what am I going to do about this? I'm not up for this. Well, of course, part of the reason people go to church is that they want to situate their children in a like-minded moral community. They want other people around them, a clan, if you will, a parish, a congregation, to affirm what they're trying to teach those children. So that's another way in which the mere having of a family inclines people toward church. And I think there are other things going on. If you have ever been married, if you've ever had children, you know that family life is based on sacrifice, right? Sacrifice and self-sacrifice, and we don't say that to scare the kids, but it's true. And the words of a sacrificial religion, like Christianity, that emphasizes laying down your life for another, are words that make a lot more sense to people who live in families than they do to people who live on their own or by and for themselves. Christianity just resonates that way. And when Christianity says you're right to make those sacrifices because the highest end is not to live for yourself but to live for others. That's something that makes a lot of sense to the families of the world, especially the mothers and fathers of the world. So you have a congruence there where the messages of Christianity make more sense to people living in families than to people living on their own. And I'm not saying this is always and everywhere true. We can all think of families full of non-believers. We can think of individual people who are holy and faithful Christians. The history of monasticism, for example, makes that point. But in general, we know from social science that people are more likely to be religious and to go to church if they are living in families. And I'm trying to explain what that's about.